A quick note before we begin for the podcast listeners out there. If anyone is interested, you can follow along on the Fairwinds Following Seas blog post for this episode, and which also includes some pictures or photos to illustrate what exactly we're talking about. So, what is it like being aboard a submarine? Well, simply put, it's sort of like being crammed inside of a sardine can. Let me explain. Despite what you see in movies or in video games, Navy submarines are not roomy. They're cramped industrial environments and not very comfortable. Everywhere you look, the bulkheads and overheads are covered with pipes, wires, buttons, valves, switches, and equipment, much of which is hard and occasionally sharp. There are hatches and cabinets all over the place, even on the deck, which open up to reveal storage spaces. The inside of a fast attack submarine, such as USS Blueback, is the literal definition of zero personal space. Even inside the enormous ballistic missile submarines, also known as boomers, most of the spaces are filled with equipment and designed around supporting the main weapon systems, in this case, the nuclear ballistic missiles. At times it seems like the human factors were almost an afterthought in the design of submarines. Then again, we're talking about the US Navy here, not a cruise line. Now, if you find pictures of ballistic missile submarines, particularly the inside, such as the control room or the area around the missile tubes, and compare it with ones from movies like, say, Crimson Tide, a 1995 film by Tony Scott, which takes place on the ballistic missile submarine USS Alabama, then you'll see a marked difference. Now, the film's production crew for Crimson Tide briefly went aboard USS Florida during pre-production. However, the US Navy withdrew its support from the film once they found out that it depicts a mutiny aboard a submarine. The film sets were built on large gimbals, which allowed the set to tilt back and forth to simulate the submarine changing angles. The inspiration for the interior sets is pretty apparent, as the overall layout looks similar, but there's more room, and not to mention moody lighting, on the film set. Apart from general ignorance on how submarine interiors look, much of the added space on film sets is to allow for camera equipment and crew. That's why submarines in movies look so spacious. The possible exceptions to this would probably be the films like Das Boot, Phantom, or Hunter Killer, as those movies were filmed aboard actual submarines, or at least the sets were very meticulously recreated. In fact, even the movie Das Boot, which is a one-for-one recreation of the interior of a Type 7 U-boat, still looks spacious because of the cameras they used. I mean, it would be far more cramped in real life than it looks on camera. This raises the question, do submariners get claustrophobic? The submarine service in the US Navy is selective and all volunteer. For enlisted sailors, the training involves 2 months at Basic Enlisted Submarine School, which teaches them the fundamentals of submarine operations. Basically, just enough to be dangerous. During Basic Enlisted Submarine School, students go through 3 damage control trainers to simulate 3 specific casualties. These are the firefighting, flooding, and submarine escape trainers. The flooding trainer, also known as the wet trainer, is a mocked-up engineering space with leaking pipes that cause the room to slowly fill with water. Students are tasked with coordinating with each other and plugging the leaks. As the water level rises, more pipes begin to leak because it's actually controlled from a control room, and the water begins to rise faster, simulating that the submarine is increasing depth and therefore the outside pressure is increasing. The room can also be blacked out, simulating a loss of electrical power and forcing the students to work in the dark with only flashlights and battle lanterns. Of course, it's a training environment, and the instructors are going to stop the exercise before anyone actually gets hurt. Still, should the students fail, there will be strong admonishments to drive the point home that they did not work together to stop the flooding in time. As a result, the submarine has now quote unquote sunk, and everyone is theoretically dead. So, congratulations, you're dead now. Basic Enlisted Submarine School also includes physical and psychological screenings to make sure students are capable of serving on submarines. Certain physical and psychological conditions are automatic disqualifiers. Obviously, anyone with claustrophobia would do well to steer clear of submarines, and the Navy in general. Seeing photographs is one thing, but imagine living and working on a submarine for months at a time. Say, for example, your boat is going on a Western Pacific cruise, or a Westpac, as we say. That's 1 2 to 3 month long patrol. Then the submarine is going to pull into port, reprovision, and you'll get a chance to see the sun again. Then the submarine will go out on another 2 to 3 month long patrol before you get back to your home port. That's basically 4 to 6 months away from home in a giant steel tube with no privacy, except your rack where you sleep, with more than 100 of your not-so-closest friends. Despite all the training and screenings, some submariners have been known to get cabin fever. Our featured tour guide for this episode is Robert Talbert, a former electronics technician. One of Blueback's volunteer tour guides, he spent his submarine service aboard boomers in the Atlantic Fleet. Robert is a friendly, soft-spoken man who is instantly recognizable among the volunteer guides because he often, but not always, wears his service dress blues, also known as the sailor suit, the blue jumper, or Cracker Jacks. In short, he definitely looks like a sailor. Robert travels around the US and has been a tour guide at numerous other submarine museums in addition to USS Blueback at OMSI. So, let's hear what Robert has to say about getting claustrophobic on a submarine. Hello everyone, my name's Tim. Welcome back to the Down Periscope, Up Periscope podcast. I'm your host, and today we have another guest speaker. We have Robert Talbot, a former submarine veteran. Now, a question I often get asked every so often on my tours is, do people get claustrophobic on a submarine? Well, it has been known to happen, and speaking to that, Robert has a quick story on that. Robert, why don't you tell us?
Hello, Robert Talbert. Yes, it was odd. My last ballistic missile patrol, big ballistic missile boat, we were under for about 2 months, and I started getting this feeling that I was gaining too much weight from all that good chow. And I kept thinking about it. Can I get through that hatch at the end of patrol? That's when it hit, the claustrophobia. Can I get out of that hatch? And I had to convince myself, I had to think it through, because we weren't coming back in just for that. Would I ever get the size of a 24-inch diameter? No, it's bigger than that. Those were about 3 foot in diameter, those hatches. And I had to think it through and logically decide that there is absolutely no way I could gain that much weight. After about a week, I finally talked myself down. Didn't tell anybody about it. That would have been a bit embarrassing, but yes, you can get claustrophobic on a submarine, even a ballistic missile boat.
Indeed. And what boat was this on?
This was on the Nathaniel Green.
As they say, you go through a lot of psychological testing, especially at submarine school, to see, if you're claustrophobic, being on a submarine is probably not for you, but here you have it from a guy who was on submarines. It can happen, indeed it does. So it took you about a week to kind of talk yourself out of it.
It did. It did.
Well, did it feel like the walls were kind of closing in on you or anything, or you were just concerned about the diameter?
The walls, yes. Could I get back out? It was just crazy, and I had to use my logical mind to talk myself down. Could I get out of the boat?
Yeah, and normally you were not claustrophobic.
Oh, no. Like you said, in submarine school, we went through the training. We did the emergency ascent for 50 foot after being closed up in a small chamber with about 8 of us with our water up to our nose. That didn't do it. About 50 of us inside of a pressure chamber. That didn't make me claustrophobic. It was very, very annoying.
Well, apparently sometimes it just gets to you.
Yes.
All right, well, thank you for that story, Robert.
Thank you.
As we give tours on Blueback, people do occasionally get claustrophobic. Visitors occasionally ask why the submarine is so cramped. My response is, Well, it's a warship, not a cruise ship. Everything in the boat is designed to support the combat systems: sonar, electronic support measures, ESM, electronic countermeasures, ECM, radar, fire control, various transmitters and receivers, propulsion, and even the torpedoes themselves constitute a multitude of systems around which the hull is built. Human factors are somewhat secondary, and believe me, navies out there are researching and developing unmanned underwater vehicles, or UUVs, which, like unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, don't require humans to be physically on them. Whether or not UUVs will eventually replace manned warships and submarines is debatable, since we still haven't gotten rid of manned aircraft. Still, if you read any design histories of these vessels, for example, Norman Friedman has an excellent series of books on naval warship design, then you can see that they're designed to fulfill a certain set of missions, none of which involve traipsing around the Caribbean on a pleasure cruise. Another question I often get is regarding whether or not there's a height restriction on submarines. To my knowledge, there is not. The tallest sailor on Blueback was 6 foot 8 inches. He walked around hunched over the whole time. In fact, here's the thing: if there is any body restriction, it's probably going to be a girth restriction, as Robert mentioned. You have to be able to fit through the 25-inch diameter hatches to get in and off the submarine, and you have to be able to move through the submarine quickly in an emergency. Put another way, if you're too tall to stand up straight on a submarine, that's a you problem. But if you can't fit through the hatches to get in and out of the submarine quickly in an emergency, that becomes everyone's problem. The enlisted crew's berthing racks, that is, their beds, are all a standard size: 6 feet 2 inches long and 2 feet wide, with 1.5 feet of vertical clearance between them. This gives an enlisted crewman slightly less than 18.5 cubic feet to sleep in, and is their only area of privacy for 6 hours in an 18-hour day, when this submarine was in operation anyway. Officers have the same size beds, but sleep in somewhat nicer 3-man staterooms, although they're still crowded. The sole exception to this is the commanding officer. He's the only person with guaranteed privacy, and has the biggest stateroom with a single rack all to himself. His rack is also the only one that you can sit up in and not bash your head against anything. As is customary in the sea service, the captain will not share his stateroom with anyone, even visiting dignitaries. It doesn't matter if you're Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz or the President of the United States. The captain gets his own stateroom. In fact, if you are a visiting dignitary, then the executive officer's stateroom has a fold-down rack from the overhead, and he'll share his cabin with you. As I mentioned in Season 1, Episode 3, I'm not particularly claustrophobic unless the spaces get really tight. Still, there are some places on Blueback that I don't particularly like to go. These will be the lower engine deck, the auxiliary machinery space, and the pump room. Mostly because those spaces are dirty and they're filled with hard and sharp objects. If you move a foot or two in the wrong direction, part of you, such as your face, is going to make contact with one of those hard and sharp objects. Even then, I hardly ever have a reason to go into those spaces, and since I've never served on an operational submarine, I've never had to deal with the confinement of being trapped on one for months at a time. On Blueback, of course, as I said, I have the option of stepping outside of the boat onto dry land for fresh oxygen. As a museum ship with the interior largely unaltered from her original design, Blueback cannot accommodate visitors with various conditions. For example, those who are wheelchair-bound or on strollers will simply not be able to access the submarine because there's no wheelchair ramp. Before the tour, visitors go through a safety briefing and have to demonstrate that they can pass unassisted through a mock-up of one of the watertight hatches. The watertight hatch itself is a 20-inch by 38-inch oval, and there are 2 of these in the sub, located at the watertight pressure bulkheads at frames 24 and 52. These doors are hydrostatically tested to withstand up to 377 psi before they're unseated. If you cannot pass through this opening, then you'll have trouble getting through the boat, and therefore you can't be on the tour. It's the narrowest door you'll pass through, and those with severe claustrophobia will probably not do well within the confined spaces of the boat anyway. That said, I have seen blind people, quadruple amputees, wearing their prosthetic legs, And even people with claustrophobia, at least to some degree, make it through the entire boat on a tour. Yes, really. I've even had claustrophobic people on my tours as well. However, it didn't seem to be a debilitating condition, and they made it through the tour just fine. Another thing is that small children, like many whom are, say, 3 to 6 years old, are often uncomfortable on the submarine. And the reality seems to hit them once they step aboard and proceed down the stairs at the entrance to the boat. Now, the stairs are steep, and children sometimes have trouble navigating them. Many of them say, like, oh, they're scared or whatever, and they aren't really prepared for the enclosed spaces. We tour guides have speculated that these children are likely claustrophobic themselves, but they don't realize it because, they're so young. Other areas of the boat, such as the control room, are dimly lit because they're rigged for red, with red lighting to simulate darkened conditions. Now, since they've never been in this kind of environment, the darkened areas can seem a little bit spooky to children. As such, they can really become freaked out and kind of scream to their parents about how scary the boat is. In fact, if it gets bad enough, the parents often elect to remove their kids from the tour. Another time, I witnessed a particularly claustrophobic visitor come aboard for a tour, not one of mine though, and upon stepping aboard, this woman informed her tour guide that she was extremely claustrophobic, but would try her best to get as far as she could through the tour. Now, once in the wardroom, the first stop inside the boat, the tour guide mentioned that the entire tour group was now partially underwater, with their lower legs essentially being submerged. Upon hearing that little factoid, this woman took off like a shot and ran back up the stairs and exited the boat. She only lasted about 1 minute on board. Thankfully, there was no dramatic freak out or anything. She just quickly and quietly exited. On one hand, I feel for her, but I must admit it was a bit amusing to watch as I was off to the side observing all of this happening. The claustrophobia of this woman was clearly intense, as if the mere mention of being partially submerged in a steel tube was enough to make her fight or flight response kick in. Again, blueback isn't going anywhere, but 2/3 of the submarine's hull, about 20 feet, is below the water. Without the hull, when you step aboard, your feet and ankles would be wet. In the end, I honestly have to question the logic of some of these people, especially those who know they're claustrophobic. On one hand, I applaud them for facing their phobia and not letting it hinder them from coming aboard for a tour if it satisfies their curiosity. Yeah, sure, go ahead. Obviously, their condition, be it claustrophobia or whatever, isn't severe enough to stop them. Yet, on the other hand, I have to ask, what do they think blueback is? A Carnival cruise ship or something? Pictures or videos online don't really do the environment justice. It's more cramped than it looks. So if you're claustrophobic to begin with, then being on a submarine probably isn't for you. Still, as Robert testified, even trained submariners can get claustrophobic at times.